Hello, and welcome to Field Lab Earth, the podcast that's all about past and present advances in the fields of agronomic, crop, soil, and environmental sciences. Today we'll be talking to Dr. David Clay about precision and sustainable agriculture. What kind of variability can you find in a field? How do we know if it's there? How can knowing these factors help us build a more sustainable future? Answers to all these and more coming right up. I'm your host, Abby Morrison. Let's talk about science. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the show. Today we have the great pleasure of having Dr. David Clay on the show. Dr. Clay is a professor of soil science, fellow of the American Society of Agronomy, previous chair of the ASA Finance Board, and previous member of the Board of Directors for the American Society of Agronomy. He's a member of the South Dakota State University Faculty Senate and current vice president, and editor for the Agronomy Journal. His research activities are focused on-farm research, soil health, precision farming, land use changes, water quality, and the development of Northern Great Plains climate-smart agricultural systems. Dr. Clay has published over 260 peer-reviewed papers and written or edited 16 books and has multiple awards in his field. Welcome to the show, Dave. How are you doing?
I am awesome. How about yourself?
I am doing super well. Well, why don't we just launch in? We're talking about precision agriculture and sustainable agriculture today. So can you just tell me on a very high level what both of those terms mean and what those things are?
So when we think about precision ag, there's a multitude of definitions that people talk about. One of the ones that I prefer is precision ag is a management strategy that uses electronic information and other technologies to gather, process, and analyze spatial and temporal data for the purpose of guiding targeted actions and improved efficiency, productivity, and sustainability of agricultural operations. Now, associated with this, when we start thinking about what that actually means, it means that we're trying to increase the amount of information that we're using to make decisions. And then implementing those decisions, we could then use equipment that provides an opportunity to vary our rates across landscapes and fields.
And that obviously goes hand in hand with sustainable agriculture. You had a nice definition that you sent me for that, if you wouldn't mind sharing that as well.
When I start thinking about what's sustainable agriculture, and again, there's a multitude of definitions, the one that I usually visit with my students about is the goal of sustainable agriculture is to meet society's food and textile needs in the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now in South Dakota, we have a fair number of Indian tribes, and what they use for their sustainability question is it doesn't impact their children's 7 generations into the future. And so when we think about it, what it means is I'm doing things today without impacting decisions of my children and grandchildren.
Wow, that's super cool. I didn't realize that there were such a variety of definitions, or just thinking that far ahead is really great. And then you actually co-edited a book with Newell Kitchen about precision agriculture basics. We're going to talk about that a little bit more later in the show. But in preparing for this episode, we mainly focused on 4 chapters. So I just wanted to take a quick minute to give the chapter titles and also the authors so they can get some due credit, obviously. So the chapters we looked at were Chapter 2, which is Understanding and Identify Variability, and that's by Newell Kitchen and Sharon Clay. We looked at Chapter 6, which is Soil Variability Measurement and Management by David Franzen. Chapter 7, which is Pest Measurement and Management by Sharon Clay, B.W. French, and F.M. Matthew. And Remote Sensing for Site-Specific Plant Management by Richard Ferguson and Donald Runquist. That's Chapter 8. So in looking at those chapters, one of the big topics that came out right at the start was variability. And so can you tell us about what does that term mean and what are some of the different types of variability that you're looking for in the field? There's 4 to 5 main groups.
So when we think about variability, we're thinking about variability that is across a landscape or across time. And so we need to consider both of those levels of variability. When we think about across landscapes, we could have elevation changes in our fields that impacts nutrient and erosion and all these different factors, as well as water stress. One of the things that we've looked at when we look across landscapes and we start thinking about what are the driving factors of yield across landscapes, what we've seen when we look at genetic responses of plants to different stresses, what we've seen is as I go up into my landscape, my upper landscape position, yields are almost always lower no matter where we're at. And that yield reduction is due to water stress. And so the leaves start cupping and the plants start looking like they're water stressed. Now, when we look at what's actually happening at a genetic level, when we look at RNA at that genetic level, what we see is the plants are responding to that stress, but the responses are coming out as specific responses to individual stresses. And so that's one of the variabilities that we start seeing across landscapes, which gets us to a question of how do we manage this variability? Well, by understanding the causes of the variability, then we have a chance to manage that variability. So that's an example of a stress that occurs in a spatial sense. In a temporal sense, one of the things that we see is we see different nutrient concentrations depending on when I take a soil sample. So if I take a soil sample in the fall, it's almost always lower than the samples that I take in the spring, and so therefore the nutrient concentrations are almost lower. And therefore we need to manage that temporal variability as well as the spatial variability. We need to bring those together in some sort of computer program or some way of thinking that allows us to manage that variability in a sustainable manner.
And then there's a couple other kinds of variability that you guys talk about in the book, abiotic and biotic stress. If you want to just quickly explain the difference between those two.
So abiotic stresses are factors that include weather, climate, and temperature functions. And so they're really things that are not biotic versus biotic stresses, which are things that include soil biology and plant biology. So they're dealing with living organisms.
Yeah, and there's a special category of biotic stress, and that's anthropogenic stress, which is anything that's human caused. And a really cool factor of that I was hoping you would touch on as well is memory effect. So can you talk a little bit about anthropogenic stress and memory effect?
So when we think about memory, we're thinking that our soils remember stuff that previously happened. For example, if I go out and band or put fertilizer on a field, the soils and the materials that I put into the soil will remain in there, and we can see that 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, or perhaps 5 years down the road. One of the things that one of my students looked at several years ago is they were looking at the effect of old livestock operations on our soil's phosphorus levels. And so we looked at that and we were looking at phosphorus levels, and in many of these fields, the livestock hadn't been present in the fields for 50 years. Yet even after that long period of time, we're able to see the elevated phosphorus levels in the fields from those livestock that were in there perhaps in the 1950s and the 1960s. So the memory effect is real. Now that's one aspect of the memory effect. There's other aspects of the memory effect that deal with the levels of soil carbon that are in our soils. And so if I think about if I put a rotation in a field that adds more carbon into that rotation than another rotation, we can see those effects of that increased carbon for a long period of time. Noel Kitchen in the chapter talks about some of that, about how we see that, and you can see that variability right along the fence rows. And so historically, you wouldn't have seen the fence rows, but we do that change, and where those changes occur, we can see that right along those fence lines in perhaps yields or in soil nutrient levels.
That's amazing. I'm so impressed by this. And something that was talked about in the book that I really latched onto was they even talk about how, like the Dust Bowl, you can see effects of that, or how just seeing the arc of history as it relates to precision agriculture and sustainable agriculture. It's cool to just see how far we've come, you know, with a lot of those historical changes that kind of fed into some of these other forms of variability and stresses and how we've just learned so much from that. I don't know if you have any comments on that as well.
Well, the Dust Bowl is a really interesting question. And so if we go back in South Dakota, and if we go to South Dakota, Nebraska, perhaps Kansas or Oklahoma, if we look along this western coast of the Great Plains, during the 1930s, soils dried out and we had a lot of erosion that occurred. The impacts of that erosion are still felt today. We can look at our landscapes and we see on our landscapes where that soil has been lost. The loss of that surface soil impacts nutrient levels and it impacts the yields that we actually see in those fields. Over the past 25 years, we've started to see rebuilding of those soil profiles. And what's happened is we've had large-scale adoption of no-tillage across this region. The no-tillage is a system where I don't actually have to cultivate that system prior to planting. I go into that system and I can plant directly, and our carbon levels start increasing. Associated with that increasing in our carbon levels is we start seeing higher yield potential. So as our carbon levels go up, our yield potential. So in the past, I might have been able to produce, let's say, 100 bushels per acre in that area. With the increase in carbon levels, I may be able to increase that to 150 bushels per acre. So the impact of that drought of the Dust Bowl was to reduce those yields and that yield potential in those areas, perhaps for 70 or 80 or 90 years, and we're just beginning to recover from those loss in that yields over the last 25 years.
Wow, that is just, it's so nuts to me that has such a large impact for such a long time. It's just really cool. I mean, unfortunate, obviously, but good that we know that now. So moving on then, now that we kind of know some of the problems or potential stressors or positive things that might be in the soil, let's move on to talk about how you can kind of monitor or sense where this variability is. So one of the chapters of the book, a couple chapters actually, talk about different ways that you can sample and sense in fields. So can you talk first about grid and zone sampling and what the difference is between those two things?
Grid sampling is collecting point information from specific locations in a field. So I have a point. I go out there and I can collect a soil sample, or I can look at plant yields, or I can look at germination, or I can look at whatever I want to look at, and that would be at that particular point. And then in grid sampling, generally what we'll do is we'll have a number of points, not just one, but we'll have many points located across the field. We then will go into that field, collect that information from each of those points, and then we can use that information to start generating maps that we can then use to, let's say, put an application map that may vary herbicide treatment, or it may vary fertilizers, or it may vary insecticides, or it may vary the types of varieties that we plant or their population. We can use that information for that choice. Now, in grid sampling, it works really well if we have limited information about that system, or if we think that we really don't understand the variability about that system. And so that's going to work for grid sampling. If we know something about the grid sampling, about the variability that we're seeing in the field, we can reduce the cost and we can increase the efficiency of data collection by using a zone sampling approach. Now, in a zone sampling approach, we separate the field into specific areas. So around a house, so if you're looking at your house and you're wondering, how do I sample my house or the yards in my house? You may say, well, my front yard's treated differently from my backyard. Therefore, I will treat my front yard differently and I will treat my backyard differently. Based on that information, we would then go into that and say, well, let's collect the information from your front yard. It may be the number of dandelions, or it may be the number of insects, or whatever information we want. And then we will then treat that entire front yard as one management zone. The backyard, we will do the same thing. We'll collect information from that backyard and treat that as a different management zone as well. That works well when we have some idea about the types of variability that we see in the field, and we can reduce the cost associated with collecting that information.
Did grid sampling and zone sampling arrive on the agricultural field of science at around the same time, or is this kind of a set of theories that have developed over time?
When I started doing precision farming in the 1990s, almost everybody at that time was doing grid sampling. And one of the things that we learned when we were doing grid sampling is I would go out into a field and we may take a soil sample from every acre. Now, in a 160-acre field, that would be 160 soil samples. And so we sampled a bunch of fields at 160 samples per field. Well, when we looked at that data, we said, well, we really can't make any sense out of it. And so he said, well, maybe we need to just be closer. And so we said, let's not just sample every acre, let's sample every quarter acre. And so as opposed to pulling one sample every acre, we were pulling 4 samples every acre. When we looked at that data, we said, oh, we can make some sense out of this, but to do this, to generate and analyze this information that may be in excess of 600 samples per quarter section, the costs are astronomical. And so we started thinking, is there a better way of how do we sample these fields? At that point, we started saying perhaps grid sampling or some sort of approach like that. We all tried at that time the thought that we would use our soil survey maps for designing our grids. Well, that worked to some extent, but we found that perhaps maybe the yield monitor information would be better, or perhaps remote sensing information for collecting and identifying those zones. So the big point is that we thought that grid sampling worked, but it was just so expensive we couldn't implement that in many fields. We then jumped and we said, well, perhaps we can reduce that cost and we can use zone sampling, where as opposed to pulling 640 samples from a field, we may be able to get by with just collecting 10, which is much less expensive.
Sure. Yeah, it's really cool just to see like the advancement of this field over time. I think that's one of my favorite parts about reading the book and just working on this project. That kind of brings me then to this other type of sensing, which is even kind of more recent, is remote sensing. So can you tell us how remote sensing works, what you're looking for, what tools you use?
So remote sensing is a tool that tries to put a sensor in the place where we used to have our eyeballs. So it's really replacing our eyeballs with something that's separating that information into different bands. So each band, let's green, blue, red, or whatever, they all represent different wavelengths in our spectral spectrum. We can collect the information from each of those bands, which has different meanings relative to the types of stresses that we see. So if I'm interested in looking at total biomass, I might be collecting information that would be from the near infrared, which is something that we can't see. It's just on the outside of what we can see, and we can compare that to information collected in the red band. We then can make that comparison, and it gives us information about the total biomass that we can actually see in our field. And the digital information is highly correlated to the amount of biomass. If I'm interested in saying how much chlorophyll I have, what we normally will do is we'll do a comparison between the near infrared. Again, that's just outside of what we can normally see in the way of wavelengths, and we compare that to our green bands. And so we can look at these different bandwidths, and they give us different information about the system. Now, the advantage that's happened, with the really exciting thing that's happened, is when Newell and I started, and a lot of people across the nation started working with remote sensing many years ago, what we would do is we'd be using Landsat information, and that's stored in South Dakota. But the Landsat is from a sensor that collects information every 30 meters across the field. And so we have pixels that are 30 meters by 30 meters. Well, 30 meters is 100 feet by 100 feet. Well, that's a relatively large area. When I start looking at what's available in this 100-meter, I can't look at, well, does it tell me anything about germination? Does it tell me anything about insects? Can I see the insects? Does it tell me anything about my plant populations? Can I use that information to look at hail damage that I had? And so what it had is it had great information, but the resolution was so large that we couldn't necessarily look at it very easily. In addition, when the information was collected, it may take us a week or two to actually look at the data before it's actually available to us. And so it was available very slowly. Over time, what's happened, we've replaced data that's collected with a satellite sensor with data that's being collected with UAVs. We can fly them over our fields. We can do that ourselves. The information is collected, and it may have resolution that we can look at individual plants, or you can look at individual weeds, or we can look at that data to actually count the number of plants per acre or count the germination of our plants as we're looking at factors that may be controlling our yields. So these new sensors are truly exciting because we can get that data. The data has the sensors, and we can put the sensors in there that measure the correct wavelengths, and we can process that data so I can shoot a field in the morning, and I can be using that information to analyze that field in the afternoon. And the next day, we can then be using that data to variable rate appropriate treatments across the field. So the technology has changed tremendously over the last 40 or 50 years.
Wow. That is just, it's so amazing to me just what you guys can do.
No, first off, just Amy, people can do it, not me. Other people can do this.
Well, still, I love that you've spent so much of your life researching this and just really dedicating yourself to this. Is awesome. Something I liked in the book that they talked about as well is that you guys still do some in-field sampling or testing. This was specifically highlighted with like pest management. So can you talk about how these in-field and remote sensing technologies go hand in hand and what gaps they might fill for each other?
Okay, so what a UAV does is a UAV collects information and it shows you where things are different, okay? So when I fly a field and you collect that digital information and then you create a map. That map, and each one of those coordinates on that map, we know where it is. And what we collect is we have this information that's called GPS that's on that sensor, and all of those points have GPS coordinates. So I know exactly what the latitude and the longitude of each point is, and then I know something about the reflectance within the individual bands. Now the problem is that in many situations, we have dissimilar stresses cause similar responses. So if I have a nitrogen stress, the plant is green, okay? Well, if I have a problem that might be iron corrosis, the plant may be yellow. And so the stresses may look very similar. Or if I have sulfur deficiency, the plants may be yellow. And so what we have to do is once we've identified and collected that information, we oftentimes have to rewalk those fields to really clearly identify what the limiting factors with. If it's diseases, if it's insects, if it's nutrients, or if it's some sort of tillage problem. We can then walk the field and identify that. Now, if you think about a 160-acre field, a 160-acre field is about 2,500 feet on a side. That's a relatively large area. To walk a field, it takes an incredible amount of time. So if I'm trying to save time and identify where I can be and try to be more efficient, the remote sensing information will tell me exactly where I need to walk to identify the critical factors. And that's a big savings for most of the agronomists across the United States and world. Now, the other part of it is that we can start seeing stresses that we've never been able to see before. We can start looking at things, and we can look at white mold. Well, in the past, what we would do is we would look at putting a fungicide on an entire field, and we would treat that as one single application. Well, once we've identified that I have a white mold in a small area, I can just go out and I can identify that small area, and then we can target the fungicide to that location. Now, the advantage of this is for many of our chemicals that we have limited amount of chemicals, and by targeting to the treatments as opposed to broadcast applying the treatments, we can reduce the opportunity for resistance in our pest plants and insects and diseases.
Hey science fans, I hope you're enjoying the show. Interested in learning more? The first chapter of Dave's book, Precision Agriculture Basics will be freely available on our digital library for the next 2 weeks. In addition, the 2019 Sustainable Agronomy Conference will be taking place on July 10th and 11th in Omaha, Nebraska. It's going to be a day and a half full of sessions related to the economics, agronomics, implementation, and environmental benefits of sustainable agronomy, with an emphasis on the latest in its science and application. Speakers will be experts from a variety of backgrounds, including certified crop advisors, agricultural retailers, growers, university faculty, government staff, and industry personnel. Enjoy time to network with speakers, moderators, colleagues, and fellow attendees, and earn up to 10 continuing education units for our Certified Crop Advisor and Certified Professional Soil Scientist programs. All talks will be recorded and made available to attendees after the conference. Links to both of these resources will be available in our show notes. Let's get back to the show. What I like about your second point about kind of being able to use your resources wisely is it kind of really leads into the sustainable side of things. So I was hoping you could talk more about how using these technologies is really helping people to develop sustainable agriculture and implement it so that we're not causing problems for 7 generations down the line. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Okay, so when we're thinking about agricultural management, one of the questions that we have is creating new chemistries are incredibly difficult. We have the same problem for human populations when we're looking at antibiotics. And so one of the questions that you have when I go to the hospital is, are the diseases that you have resistant to the antibiotic that I apply? We have the same problems with our production fields. And so what we want to do is to maintain the production potentials of our individual locations. We need to wisely manage our resources, and it may be that I'm going to wisely manage my crop varieties that I plant, or I'm going to wisely manage the types of chemicals that I apply to that land, or I'm going to wisely manage the use of insecticides or seed treatments or all these different things. By targeting and using only what we need, we can try to minimize the development of resistance within that pest disease. If we create pests that are resistant to the chemicals that we have, we're going to have a problem with controlling those chemicals in the future, because there's really very few chemicals that are coming on the market in the near future. The chemical companies are almost investing very little money in the development of new chemistries. And so we need to protect the chemistries that we have and maintain their long-term sustainability. So that's one aspect that we think about sustainability. The other aspect that we need to think about sustainability is just erosion. And how do we minimize that erosion, and how do we identify perhaps areas that we have problems with erosion or areas that we don't? Well, precision farming can help in sustainability question associated with that. Oftentimes we start talking about that when we start talking about erosion and those factors, we're oftentimes thinking about precision conservation, which there's a new book that the American Society of Agronomy and Soil Science Society and Crop Science have just finished publishing.
We'll include some information about that new book as well in the show notes, in addition to your own book. But there are also some limitations to what the current science can do. You know, like you said, for example, the grid sampling, you know, you can't just grid sample everything because it's too expensive. Can you talk about challenges to adoption that farmers face when looking at this kind of agriculture?
So when Newell and I started working in precision farming in the 1990s, we had distinct challenges. I could generate information. I could go out and get information. We had a challenge creating maps. Okay, so I collected the information. How do I generate a map from that? That was the first challenge. The second challenge is, how do I actually put that into a computer program that can drive an that I can put into equipment? So we had challenges with every single step. It made it complicated and it made it difficult to implement. What our engineers have been doing is to reduce those hurdles. So nowadays, I don't have a problem with collecting information and generating maps. I don't have a problem with getting that map information into, let's say, a variable rate applicator. My problem that I have is, what am I going to use for my algorithms to control that applicator? And so in that process, in order to create those algorithms, we have to go from where our current recommendations are, which may be on a regional or national level, down to a site-specific information. So what we're trying to do in many situations is we're taking algorithms for almost anything that were created at the regional level or state level, and taking that information and creating locally based recommendations that account for the variability in individual farm fields. Information that's used to drive that data may be data that's actually collected by the farmer. And so he may be doing strip trials using on-farm techniques into his farm. We're in the process of creating a special issue in Agronomy journal dealing with those issues. He will then take that information, develop locally based site-specific recommendations based on his data that will manage the problems in his field. There's an incredible amount of algorithm work that has to be done, and that's in the process of a lot of different scientists across the United States and world.
Are there other advances that you see on the horizon for precision or sustainable agriculture, whether that's in like the tools you use to gather information or anything else really? Where's the future research for this headed?
So one of the future research areas that people keep thinking about is big data. Okay, big data. Well, precision farming is big data. And so in order to analyze the data, we have to have the analytical tools and skills to analyze that information. If we think about one quarter section with a yield monitor, one quarter section with a yield monitor generates about 50,000 data points. That's from 1 year. If I have 2 years, that's 100,000. If I have 10 years of data, the data is huge. In order to make sense out of the information in the future, we have to look back on the data. And the question is how do I analyze that data from the past to help make recommendations into the future? And that's where a large chunk, a large piece of where a lot of resources are going is, how do we analyze this data? How do we use that information to then create locally based recommendations? It's an exciting area, and we really, in many situations, don't know how to do it very well. We're just beginning in that area of research.
That's really cool. I like that, you know, it's amazing. Obviously 50,000 is hugely different than, 140. And so it's just such a pleasure to get to see how much this has grown over time and to see kind of the trajectory of where it's going. That's just really, it's very exciting to me. And to see just how it all overlaps and comes together is just really incredible. So thank you so much for all the work that you and your compatriots are doing. The world appreciates it and needs it. I have 3 questions left for you. So the first question, as ever, is where can people go to learn more information? And specifically tied to that, can you tell us more about your book?
To collect information, and I'm going to leave that up to you, Abby, you can tell them where the digital library is and how to access the books that are in the digital library. And you can tell them what the titles are and all that information. How about if you do that first?
Sure. So the book specifically for this episode is called Precision Agriculture Basics. You can find it on our digital library. We will have a link in the show notes specifically for your book. You can also just go to our homepage and there's a link to our books where you can search for all kinds of books. We'll also include a link for that precision conservation book that's coming out. So that's where you can find it.
So we actually wrote 2 books. One of them is Precision Farming Basics, and the second book is Practical Mathematics for Precision Farming. Both of those books were based off of surveys that we did using the American Society of Agronomy CCAs. So we sent them surveys, the people who have CCAs, the Certified Crop Advisors, and we asked them what they think people need to know. So that was one source of information. The other source of information that we did is we sent surveys to schools that are teaching precision farming programs. So we asked them what they're teaching. And then we went to the large corporations and we asked them, what do you need relative to precision farming programming in your people that you hire? We got a universal answer, which is our people that we're hiring don't have good enough math skills. And so we generated 2 different books for that. One of them was dealing with the current technologies of precision farming, and the second one was dealing with the math skills to get them up to the point that the industry people would say that they're the types of people that they want to employ. And so we put those 2 different pieces together. The results from the surveys are available in the Education Journal.
Natural Sciences Education?
Yeah, they're in that journal. So the results of those surveys are in Natural Science and Education Journal. So you can access that information in those journals. The outcome of that was these 2 books. Well, when we put the books together, what we were really trying to do is how do we make this content in the books speak to you? And so what Newell did is we did 2 different things. One of them is we had world leaders who are infinitely understanding what's going in the technologies, write individual chapters. Combined with that is we asked experts in precision farming to do short interviews. And so the book contains over 60 videos of people doing interviews along with all of the different chapters that the experts have written. The topics range from how do we sample to what are the technologies coming online and how do we do remote sensing. Again, all of the chapters were targeted toward fitting into curriculum and teaching people in a unified manner about what's going on in precision farming. This is fundamentally different than a lot of other books that we just ask people to write chapters relative to research. This isn't designed as a research book. It's really designed as a book for curriculum that can integrate into an extension program or into classes.
We'll for sure include links to all of those resources in the show notes. I didn't read the mathematics book, but I did read some of the chapters of Precision and Ag Basics, and I really enjoyed it, even as a non-scientist, and thought it was very easy to read and comprehend. So kudos to all of the authors we mentioned before. You guys did a great job, and I know we at the Societies really appreciate all of the work that you and Newell and all of those authors did in putting that book together. We've heard great stuff. So thank you for that. Also, shout out to our CCAs for helping. You guys are great too. I know they listen, so hello. The other resource that I would like to mention is we actually are also doing a sustainable agronomy conference. We did one last year here in Madison, and this one for 2019 is in Omaha, Nebraska. It's July 10th and 11th. And yeah, it's going to be a day and a half where you guys can all meet together and learn from a variety of speakers with a variety of backgrounds about all of these topics. And we'll have more information on that in the show notes as well. Early bird registration ends for that on May 11th. So then the second question is, if people are interested in getting involved with these areas, where can they go? What can they do to help?
So a lot of the activities that we worked on in these books, and along with the precision farming curriculum, is really coming out of topics that were identified by our precision farming communities in the American Society of Agronomy. So we had 2 communities. One of them was sensor-based technologies, and the other community was precision farming systems. People in those communities and the leadership of those communities really helped do the reviews of the chapters, but they helped write the chapters, and it was critical. If you're interested in becoming more involved in the precision farming technologies, my suggestion is to contact the leadership, go to the webpage for American Society of Agronomy, and contact the leadership for those 2 communities. What we've also agreed to do, Abby, is that any of the royalties coming from the books are going to go back to the communities to help in programming.
Oh, wow. That's awesome. You guys are great. So thank you for that. And then final question for you. What is one fun fact about you that people would not know if all they had was your research?
So one of the fun things that I enjoyed doing when I got done, I went to school at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and so I'm really well familiar with Madison. But when I got done with school, I wanted to play a little bit. So I went out to Idaho and I joined a fire crew. And I was fighting fires, and we were flying helicopters, landing on mountaintops to go fight fires. And you hear about it all the time nowadays. But at the time, it was pretty exciting. So we'd head out, fight fires, and then we get done, and we'd be out on the fire line for a week, and we get done, and we'd usually have some pretty good fun times. Now, one of the things that I found is that I was doing this out of Madison. Well, Newell Kitchen was doing the same thing. And so we were both fighting fires at different times after we graduated from school.
Oh my gosh, how fun. I had no idea. I just think it's super awesome that you guys have been buddies and colleagues for so long. So yeah, what a very fun fact. I don't know that I would consider fighting a fire play for myself, but I'm glad that you do. So thanks for doing that as well. So yeah, thank you so much for being on the show. It's been a joy and a pleasure. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to be part of the show.
Wonderful. Thank you for listening to Field Lab Earth. You'll find a link to today's paper and other resources for this episode in our show notes or on our website. If you have any questions, comments, or recommendations for show topics, please contact us at podcast@sciencesocieties.org or on Twitter @FieldLabEarth. If you'd like to hear more content like this, please subscribe, and don't forget to rate and review us on iTunes or anywhere else you find your podcast if you like our show. This podcast is a joint production of the Tri-Societies, the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, and Soil Science Society of America. Special thanks to Lobo Loco for the use of their song Spook Castle on the intro and outro of our show. Opinions and conclusions expressed by authors are their own and are not considered as those of the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, Soil Science Society of America, its staff, its members, or its advertisers.